Welcome to the Place Northwest Masterclass podcast series,
where experts share their wisdom on key aspects of the property industry.
We're tackling everything from how to convert a listed building to the best way to hold a public consultation.
Don't miss a single episode. Subscribe now at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe
or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Hello and welcome to this Place Northwest podcast. Today's episode is part of our Masterclass series, where we are joined by experts and market leaders from across the property industry to talk about best practices across a range of topics. Today's Masterclass is brought to you by Buttress Architects. I'm joined by Stephen Anderson, Director at Buttress, who is going to give us an insight into how to convert a listed building. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to convert a listed building, I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about your passion for listed buildings and this part of architecture.
I think it was probably too many castles as a child. Holidays in Wales where we'd be across all the castles in North Wales and seeing all those amazing old buildings. And that's something that stayed with me forever, basically. So now not only do I do my day job in historic buildings, but I volunteer with the Building Preservation Trust and take forward projects with them as well. So I'm immersed in historic buildings, to say the least.
Do you have a favourite historic building?
Really difficult one. We're working at Carnarvon Castle at the moment, which is just an incredible building, and it's a real privilege to work on. And much as some of my colleagues might shoot me for this, I actually prefer Balmaris Castle for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, I think that's probably my favourite.
Excellent. So we're going to talk a little bit about the things you absolutely need to know and the mistakes to avoid when converting a listed building. But first, I want you to tell me a little bit about why we should care, essentially, about listed buildings and why we should bother converting them and not just knock them down and build again.
I think there's all sorts of reasons. I mean, these things have existed for a long time, and a lot of time and energy has been put into those buildings, and they become part of the community. In a lot of cases, they become something that people have a great deal of passion about, and you know, they want to see them conserved. And then you can layer into that the whole climate change agenda. You know, if we can effectively reuse these old buildings, then we make massive carbon savings as a result, and that's, you know, clearly a really important thing.
Yeah, that's something that the government or the special environment committee has actually said today. There should be less of a focus on demolition and more of a focus on reuse and rebuild. And the point you make about them becoming ingrained in the community is true. We've seen loads of examples of this recently. Stockport Central Library, no danger of that being demolished, but the library's moving out of it, and a lot of people are very upset about that, and they're worried about the future of that building. So these really are, that people hold them quite close to their hearts, don't they, these sorts of buildings?
They absolutely do. They're part of these places. You know, they are part of the character of the places that people enjoy being in, whether that be a city centre like Manchester or whether that be the towns and villages that surround it. So, you know, you lose those historic buildings from those places, and you lose a little bit of what those places are all about. And you know, we need to kind of hold on to that from a kind of place-making perspective, as well as from thinking about it from kind of just a pure historic building perspective or from a climate change perspective.
Is it always the right thing to restore a listed building if there is one?
No, not always. I mean, again, it's a kind of potentially a difficult topic for somebody as passionate as I am in historic buildings to talk about. But there are occasions where we simply need to let them go, where a building has become so dilapidated and the chances of its reuse so remote, that the best thing to do is to let go of it and replace it with something that can serve its community going forward. Those are unusual circumstances. It's, in my experience, very rare that that's the case. But it is an important thing to think about.
So let's start then with the need to knows. So if we're going about converting a listed building, I want you to tell me the three things that you absolutely need to know to get started. So what would be the first one, do you think?
The first one is you've got to understand that building, and you've got to understand it not just in terms of its physicality, it's 3 dimensions. You've got to understand its 4th dimension as well. You've got to understand what's happened to it over time. You've got to understand why that building came to be and what makes it significant. What are the stories about that building? What is it that people hold dear about it? What might be the technological advances that took place in that building? What might be the associations with events or historical figures that help to shape that building? All of those things make it significant, and understanding that significance is absolutely key to making good decisions about any historic building.
So you essentially have to become an expert in whatever building it is that you're working on.
Yeah, in proportion. So if we were talking about Manchester Town Hall, clearly you do need to become an expert in a building that's that significant. Whereas a building of lower significance, say something that's quite local, it's not designated, so it's not got a grade listing, then the need to kind of understand it to that depth is reduced. So we talk about proportionality in historic buildings and the level of detail that we understand them in, and that proportionality means that the kind of documentation we might produce to understand significance and the depth of research that goes into it will be far higher for a far more significant historic building.
And on that research point, practically, how would you go about learning about a building? Where do you go? Do you just go to the library and dig around for information?
Google's a good start. So there's often quite a lot of information on buildings online. The other one that we probably enjoy spending far too much time in are the archives that are dotted around the country, and they can hold some amazing records. The discoveries you make just in terms of documentary information as you're researching these buildings. Local archives are a really good source.
So understanding the significance of the building is important, but is there not an argument to say that in this modern age, 2022, where we can do anything with the tap of a thumb, that these buildings don't have any significance anymore and we should just get rid of them?
Wow, that's a good curveball. I don't think so. From my point of view, I think all the technological advances that we've made, we're surrounded by technology even sat in this room right now, which is doing incredibly sophisticated things and allow us to communicate in this way. They're fantastic, but we need those anchor points in our lives as well, those things that are the familiar and the comfortable and the things that have been there for a long time and just ground us. And historic buildings play a really important role in grounding us in that way. No different to maybe pieces in a museum. Similar kind of logic applies, that these are the things that can tell us stories of the past that help to inform the future. We shouldn't hold on to these things for no reason. There are, as we said before, there are occasions where we do have to let go of these things and we have to allow the modern to take their place. But that's got to be a carefully considered decision, and it's got to be considered against why that thing is important in the first place.
Okay, moving on. The second point, what's the second thing that you need to know when converting a listed building?
It's a complex one, but you've got to kind of understand the economics of these buildings as well. We have a kind of a concept called conservation deficit, and what we find, perhaps more so in northern England than in the south of the country, is that the cost of repairing these buildings can often outweigh any value that building might have. And that kind of idea of conservation deficit is quite important. So understanding those economics before you leap into decisions about what you might do with a building is important. All too often we see situations where a building in poor condition that might be in a location that somehow seems attractive will be purchased at auction by somebody who hasn't done any due diligence, and then they've just caught a cold, and they find themselves in a very difficult position where, selling it, they're probably going to lose money. They can't invest money into it because they'll never derive any value, so it gets stuck. The building declines, and the fall guys from that tend to be the community around that building who have to kind of suffer with this blight that sits at the heart of their community. So, that idea of informed decision making isn't just about significance, it's also about the economics of these developments.
Okay, and how can we overcome that conservation deficit? What are the routes out of that?
Grant funding comes into play, and obviously that can't be applied to all circumstances. There's a finite amount of it out there, but there are funders that are interested in these buildings and will contribute. Ultimately, it comes down to just I guess, tempering development ambition and making sure that there are good decisions being made on what interventions might take place within that building. Sometimes it just isn't possible. Sometimes development economics just completely stifle the opportunity to take forward an historic building. More often than not, we find that there is a way if the whole team around that building kind of apply a lot of intelligence, put the groundwork in, and kind of take it forward in an intelligent way. So, an example might be we find in some places the default position is that residential development would be the way to convert and bring back into use an historic building. But sometimes the level of intervention that needs, and the sheer amount of work that goes into it, and quite expensive work, means that isn't the most economic way to deal with that building. So developers that are a little bit more flexible with the uses that they can put into place, they are often more successful in bringing these historic buildings forward.
Okay, that's interesting. One interesting example of how a developer got around that conservation deficit is, again, in Stockport, a project you're probably familiar with, Weir Mill, capital and centric project. They're converting 2 old mill buildings into residential, but in order to make that viable, they're also building 2 new build blocks, which attracted the ire of the public because it's near the listed viaduct. So by saving these listed mills, you're doing something that in some people's opinion is detrimental to another listed structure. So it's a difficult thing to navigate, isn't it?
It's a real balancing act. That is a kind of a principle called enabling development, where the kind of profit from a more economically viable development in the context of an historic building might cross-fund and subsidise the works of the historic building. That's quite a commonly used principle. And it's also fair to say that projects like Weir Mill have grant funding in them. So Homes England, I understand, have contributed to that project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the council actually is forward funding it as well through the Mayoral Development Corporation. So they obviously wanted to see that happen. Can you give me any examples of Buttress projects that you're working on at the moment where you've found a way around that conservation deficit?
So there's a number, and different techniques have been applied to some of those projects. So we might talk a little bit more detail about some of these later, but Ancoats Dispensary is an obvious example. That's a project where there's a density of development being created within the shell of Ancoats Dispensary, and it also uses some grant funding through Homes England to bridge that conservation deficit there. Projects like Stretford Public Hall, it's a project that wouldn't normally be kind of economically viable. It's not that kind of investable a project in normal terms. So grant funders, recognising the social benefits of investing in that project, have put grant aid into it. And those are kind of 2 approaches that might get taken.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'll go into more detail about those projects in a little while. Okay, fantastic. So understanding the significance of the building, understanding property market failure and conservation deficit. What's the third point that you absolutely need to know when converting a listed building?
I mean, it's this one's perhaps a less commonly known one, but there's a principle within the kind of listed building legislation that the building takes primacy over the use. And to kind of explain that, there are some buildings that might accept a residential use really, really easily. A building that's already quite cellular perhaps, and the room sizes lend themselves to bedrooms and living spaces. But that building might not lend itself to having a swimming pool in it, just to take a silly example. And the way that the legislation works, the use, a use like a swimming pool would probably be precluded from a building that simply can't accept it without such a radical impact on its significance. So taking walls out and digging floors out and, having all those impacts, putting massive plant rooms in, all those kind of things would damage the building to a point where it probably wouldn't get listed building consent, but residential use would. So it's kind of going into these buildings and thinking about what is the best use for the building rather than can the building be adapted to the use. Right.
So I suppose it's important then for a client to get somebody like you on board early doors to let them know what's possible there.
Absolutely. And all that due diligence is kind of really important in investment decisions in historic buildings. These buildings can be passion projects, but passion can be very expensive at times and it can run into pretty serious difficulties.
Yeah. Can you give me any examples of conversations you've had with clients about maybe something that they wanted to do that you just said absolutely not possible?
We try our best to get ahead of those conversations and have kind of good dialogue around them.
Let's move on then. So we've spoken about the need to knows. Things like converting a listed building or anything really that requires expertise is fraught with danger. And I want to talk now about the mistakes to avoid. So what would be the number one mistake to avoid when going about converting a listed building?
We think that engaging with the public is an important part of these processes. And so conversely, avoiding that engagement is quite an error in our view. The reason for that is that historic buildings do awake passions in the communities around them, and that passion can become, if it's not recognised and listened to, can become really difficult. Organised campaigns against works to historic buildings, whatever those works might be, happen all the time, and we see it in the press and the media. In our experience, when we engage with those communities at an early stage, not only does it help them to feel listened to and understood, and they're able to have a forum for the points they want to make, we actually find that we learn from that, and it improves the projects that we're working on a regular basis. So that would be a really common pitfall, is kind of avoiding that public engagement in the early stages of projects. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it, though, because, and I don't particularly like this word, but NIMBYs are often spoken about. There's a project in Manchester that I remember where there was some listed buildings on the site, and the developer wanted to demolish them and build a residential block, and they said it wasn't viable without demolishing these buildings. And it went through planning, I think, several times. It was before committee, and it kept going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. The buildings there, some would argue, were just sitting there derelict. They weren't serving any purpose. In that instance, is involving the public just making your life harder?
It can obviously be perceived that way, but I think that kind of open and honest dialogue at an early stage, a meeting of minds, if you like, can resolve a lot of issues. And even if we find we don't always meet eye to eye on these things, we don't always agree, but that kind of idea of an honest dialogue and an exchange of points of view, at the very least, shows that people are prepared to listen to each other, and that can diffuse a lot of animosity in these kind of complex planning situations that sometimes arise. Okay,
brilliant. So not consulting with the public could be a mistake. What's another mistake that could get in the way of a successful conversion of a listed building?
I think that there are lots of common misconceptions about the whole planning process around listed buildings, and making sure that process is understood is kind of important. And again, conversely, if you misunderstand that process, you can head into some pretty difficult territory. It's kind of recognising that there are certain skills and knowledge that can support going through a planning process smoothly with listed buildings. And that can include having good conservation architects on board, such as myself, obviously, including kind of heritage consultants, engineers that are well versed in historic buildings and kind of understand the technical issues that can arise with working within them. All of those kind of skills mean that when a planning application is presented to the local authority, it will be of a standard and a quality that persuades the local authority that it's been considered in detail and to an appropriate degree. It's very, very easy to find yourself in a situation as an owner of a historic building looking to develop it, and where that expertise hasn't been injected into it, the sticking points start to arise with the local authority. They will look for additional information that the skills and experience of the team maybe just can't meet. And you can find an impasse position, which, Buttress have been involved in projects where we've helped to resolve those impasses, sometimes by injecting very little expertise into the process, just to nudge things in the right direction. But you can kind of see this kind of history of just, I guess, a lack of experience in that field and a misunderstanding of the process, which is a heavily evidence-based process.
Yeah, so having the right team early doors can really help when it comes to planning. But I guess that comes at a cost, doesn't it? And it's already a costly process converting a listed building, so you have to have that funding behind you in order to build that team and get it through planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the kind of unfortunate things with historic buildings, that sometimes the tests for planning processes and the like can be more expensive to go through than perhaps a more conventional building. But again, the converse is also true. Without that expertise involved, you can find that the process becomes more costly, because you have to kind of pile in more and more money to get that planning process across the line, when with the right team and at an early stage, all that investment is kind of taken place, and those pitfalls don't arise and don't become a kind of costly problem at a later stage.
Yeah, so get your ducks in a row so you don't end up chasing your tail, basically.
Nice way of putting it.
So, and I just wondered as well, from your experience in terms of local authorities, we're talking about the planning process here. Generally across the board, would you say that their understanding of conservation projects and listed buildings is of a high level, or does it vary from authority to authority? It's
a mixed picture. It's worth kind of maybe bearing in mind that we've had a period where austerity has been in place, and a lot of local authorities have had to kind of reduce their staffing, and in some cases conservation officers have been the victims of that. So there is less of that kind of conservation expertise around. Local authorities that have got good conservation expertise, there are plenty of them by the same token, and some brilliant local authorities to work with from that kind of perspective. But it is a very mixed picture at the moment, and some local authorities have literally no conservation expertise, buy it in on an ad hoc basis, and that obviously creates its own challenges.
Oh, that's really interesting, and it sounds expensive as well.
It's interesting because they've done it for cost-saving reasons, for lots of genuine good reasons, but you would imagine that buying it in on a more consultancy basis would be quite an expensive way of approaching it. All I can assume is that it works for them.
Yeah. I'm not going to ask you to tell me which of the authorities are bad at this, but can you give me an example of an authority that you've worked with that has really sort of got their finger on the pulse of what's required in terms of restoring listed buildings?
There's several, and a number of them are kind of Greater Manchester authorities, but to spare people's blushes given the audience, one of the ones we really enjoy working with is Gwynedd Council in North Wales. The conservation officer there also carries a development control role, which means that from a listed building consent point of view, she is the decision maker, not just an advisor to the process, as conservation officers often are. And we find that really helpful. And we find that the way that they approach listed building consent applications is just very constructive and helpful, even though, they, in common with other local authorities, find themselves over capacity in terms of how much workload they've got.
Brilliant, fantastic. Nice that you moved away from Greater Manchester there. Big shout out for North Wales. Okay, the third mistake that you need to avoid when converting a listed building.
I think there's a thing in kind of not thinking about what the end of that project is. So it's quite easy, I think, to sort of see the immediate step in front of you, but not think further ahead. So, let's kind of take the example of the planning process. Most developers, quite rightly, from the point of view of the economics of development and trying to invest, an appropriate amount of money in the early stages and not kind of overinvest, will look to minimise what they submit as a listed building consent application. The reality of that is that means some of the thinking around how you actually construct that project, how you deliver it, can't really take place because the funding isn't there to do it. And it's quite often the case then that unanticipated pitfalls arise while that project is on site. So, if a really good condition survey hasn't been taken out at an early stage, if that hasn't happened, then there might be condition issues that just go missed. The amount of times we go into historic buildings that have had major dry rot outbreaks that haven't been recognised because that early stages work hasn't been done, and then that becomes a very expensive problem to resolve, which will have been progressing all the time that the other activities have been taking place. So those kind of things, that idea of starting with the end in mind is particularly important with historic buildings, we find.
Okay, excellent. And in terms of your role as an architect, once you've achieved planning permission, would you still be quite hands-on and go to site and make sure things are being done the way that you intended them to be done?
It's what we like to do. Depends on the needs of our clients. Most of our clients work with us in that way. They value the expertise that we can bring into the delivery stages of projects, but that's obviously not always the case. It's very project specific. Quite often, we might only be involved in very early stages of a project, depending on how that progresses and the way the client wants to take it forward. But we very much enjoy getting into that level of detail and supporting our clients to kind of think about those issues that I mentioned earlier at an early stage and avoiding the pitfalls that might arise later.
And in terms of, we hear a lot about value engineering in new build projects. So something will go through planning, the CGI will look great, it'll get built, and then it doesn't really look anything like it. Does that happen with converting listed buildings? Can you value engineer, or are the rules stricter in terms of you have to stick to what was planned because it's a listed building?
The rules are a little bit stricter. A listed building consent tends to nail down the detail to a greater extent than, say, a typical new build planning permission. That isn't to say that you still can't value engineer. We especially at the moment, projects do run over budget. It's a regular occurrence. The market is hot at the minute in terms of construction industry. So we do find that tender returns are high, and we need to go through a process of seeing where we can bring those projects within budget. I think it's just recognising that it's a little bit easier in the context of a listed building to trip over the listed building consent and find yourself looking at changes that might not be consented, and it's just something to be aware of.
Okay, fantastic. So we've gone through the need to knows, and we've gone through the mistakes to avoid. I wonder now, Steve, if you could take us through a couple of examples, maybe the ones you mentioned before, of projects that you've worked on where you've implemented some of the things that we've spoken about. Give us a bit more detail about the case studies that you have.
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier Ancoats Dispensary, which is one that I guess a lot of your listeners will be really familiar with, and we talked about Stretford Public Hall as well. So Ancoats Dispensary, built in 1874, it remained in use till about 1989, fell out of use. A community organisation coalesced around it at that time, sought to bring it back into use, and unfortunately weren't able to implement some of their ideas. So the building languished a little bit longer. What that community organisation did do is they were able to get some investment in all of that early stages work. So when we came into the project working with our client, Great Places, we had a conservation plan, we had really good record information, we had drawings of the building. So we had that baseline understanding from day one of what is important about this building. We had to do a little bit of work to understand how it had deteriorated over time, particularly looking at the kind of structure of the building, what was salvageable, what wasn't, and bearing in mind that in essence that building had become a shell. So you've got the kind of the principal elevations and a few internal walls, and that was kind of about it. No finishes, no fixtures, none of the kind of decorative features that you might anticipate within a building of that age. The tower had been dismantled and was held off site, so there was an exercise to understand the condition of that and understand what pieces were still there and how they could go back together as part of the project. And ultimately to kind of design a scheme which recognised the significance of the building but sought to give it a new life. And in this case, a socially beneficial use in terms of affordable housing going into that building. Which is, I believe, just in the process of starting on site at the moment. Yeah. So a really exciting development and, a building which has kind of held the community's interest for a long time. And it's great to see it going back into a use that will support its local community as well. A privilege to be a part of. Looking forward to seeing how that one develops now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a prime example of what you mentioned before about it being difficult to overcome that conservation deficit. It's just sat there for years and years. Probably everybody knows a building near where they live that they'd love to see converted, but these problems exist. I wonder as well if you could tell me a bit about how the rules about what you can and can't do to listed buildings have changed over the years, because it seems that in the past people just did whatever they want. You mentioned there the tower had been dismantled. We hear about insensitive modern additions to buildings all the time. When and why did those rules tighten on what you can and can't do to buildings?
The rules have been consistent for quite a while. I think it's the application of the rules that's varied over time, and the sophistication of our understanding of historic buildings has developed over time as well. In some respects, the importance we place on them has evolved over time too. So I think we're just cleverer at dealing with them now. We don't make the mistakes that we've seen in the past around those insensitive additions and changes. We've got better technology to handle some of these issues. So you take the kind of thing with Encote's dispensary of the tower being taken down. For structural reasons, it was felt to be an important decision at the time. But did they have the ability to assess that in lots of detail? Did they have a drone they could throw up into the air and photograph it so that they could look at that better? Was there a cherry picker available of that reach that could get them up close and personal to that masonry? So we can make better decisions now, actually, because of some of the technological advancements that have been made. If we were tackling that building now, would the same process have gone on? Probably not. We would probably be able to save a lot more of the historic fabric. Conversely, that also means that the opportunity we've been able to take to insert a really good piece of contemporary architecture into that building, it wouldn't have manifested itself in the same way. So, we call it fate. Things happen for a reason. But in this case, there's going to be a really good use in that building that preserves the elements of it which people most recognise. We feel under the circumstances it's a really good result. I think it's kind of worth noting that, that doesn't mean there haven't been kind of some sacrifices and some changes. And we've had to extend the footprint of that building to get a level of development that can support it from a financial perspective. And Homes England have invested in that project as well. And that's all about, again, bridging that conservation deficit.
So what is it that's special about Encote's dispensary as a building? Can you just give us a potted history of that?
It was part of that kind of whole Encote's hospital complex, and it was the dispensary, so it was the area of it that acted as a kind of pharmacy building. The local community had that as part of their local medical facility. Bearing in mind that it's of an age that predates the NHS, so you're thinking about a building which was a kind of an early precursor to organised medical care within the UK. So all of those things make it really significant. It's also just a really beautiful piece of architecture. That kind of Gothic type design is just really lovely, and in a red brick, which is very Manchester. So, it's just a fantastic heritage asset.
Yeah, absolutely. And now part of the whole regeneration of that area as well, which is important.
And we talked earlier about those kind of anchor points. So, personally, I think it's really important to kind of conserve some of those elements of the past because they help to anchor the future. And Encote's dispensary is definitely an example of that.
Excellent. Tell us a bit about Stretford Public Hall then. Is that a similar kind of project, or how did that differ?
Very, very, very different. So, you're talking about a housing association, registered provider-led development in Encote's dispensary, saving a building which was, very at risk in very poor condition, and finding a way to overcome the conservation deficit. With Stretford Public Hall, this is about community action. This is about a community taking on an historic building that had fallen into disuse. It was no longer something that the local authority there needed to operate. They consolidated elsewhere, left that building vacant, and the community organisation that have taken on that were able to do it through a community asset transfer. The community action in this case meant the community quite literally putting their hands in their pockets and buying community shares in that building to be able to acquire it and then begin that whole refurbishment process. And we've been really fortunate to be able to kind of share a part of that journey. So the community organisation there had already done quite a bit of work in making sure that building could be used, and we've been able to help them to restore some of the principal spaces using funding from National Heritage Fund, Architectural Heritage Fund in particular, as well as all that community fundraising that they've done as an organisation.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, a brilliant insight into what it takes to convert a listed building and some fantastic examples as well as successful projects. To summarise quickly then, and correct me if I've misunderstood, but the key to converting a listed building successfully, you must understand the significance of the building. You must understand the property market and how to overcome conservation deficit. And you need to understand that the listed building takes primacy over anything else. Don't try and put a swimming pool in an old church, for example. Mistakes to avoid include not consulting the public, misunderstanding the planning process, and not seeing the project through beyond planning. Stephen, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully everybody listening has learned a little something today about how to convert a listed building.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.